The 2 other times I've done this have been great fun, and actually there are a couple of people who previously attended. I don't know if they come anymore, but I've actually made very good friends with them as well, former members of the group. So I like this group very much. And one of the things I liked about it both other times is how opinionated people are. I'm a teacher at U of T. I firmly believe in polite but real disagreement. I think it's very boring when everyone has the same attitude towards everything. And so I liked that I was hearing so many things that I, as a fan of this film, and actually to what one of the gentlemen was saying, as a member of a critics group that gave this film an award, the Toronto Film Critics Association chose this as the best film of 2008, which was an odd decision at the time. A lot of people in North America were surprised that we chose this movie instead of something else. So hearing things that I agreed with, things about ideology, things about capitalism, people mentioning neorealism, bringing up Balthazar by Bresson, which is an interesting comparison to this film. And also I like hearing things that I disagreed with, the question of banality, the question of boredom, not because I don't think those things are valid. I think that it's very easy to see this as a banal film or as a boring film. I think to some extent the movie cultivates that feeling, but it's a movie that I have very strong positive feelings about. So I want to talk about those, but I also felt some responsibility to try and connect the movie to the theme that you guys are looking at in these 12 films. I sort of think that some of the points that each of you raised we can talk about in the Q&A, and they are covered in my lecture. But when I was sent the list of films and sent the name of this season that you guys are working through, I believe the title was Encountering the Other. And so I thought that that is a very interesting idea to apply not only to Wendy and Lucy, but to the movies of this filmmaker, this woman named Kelly Reichert in general. Are any of you familiar at all with Kelly Reichert's other films? I imagine those of you who are big film fans may have seen a few. I'm glad that you're not, because I want to talk a little bit about her, which I think will help contextualize this film. Kelly Reichert has made 5 movies to date. Her first film was made in 1994. Her most recent film came out last year. And in all of these 5 films, she focuses on characters who feel in some way alienated from their immediate environment. Wherever the movies are set, or whoever they're about, they're people who do not feel comfortable where they are. And by extension, if we try and interpret the films, if we try and read the clues that the movies give us, which all of you have done, I think, very successfully already with this film, we see that it's not just people who are alienated from their neighborhood, or not just people who are alienated from their city. They're people who are alienated in some way from America, either from American life or from an idea of American life, or an idea of American life that they do not believe. And Kelly Reichert is an American filmmaker. She's based in New York, but most of her films take place in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. So she's something that we would consider in film studies to be a kind of regional filmmaker. She doesn't make movies about LA, she doesn't make movies about Los Angeles, she doesn't make movies where Los Angeles stands in for another part of the world. She films in real places in the United States. She doesn't just film in those places, she makes movies about those places. She makes movies about American towns, about American cities, about American geography, and about American social and cultural divisions. And I wonder for a group of us in Toronto, or I wonder for a group of us who have very diverse backgrounds that are not just simply Canadian or not just simply North American, how much we care or how much we connect to the extent that Reichert's film is about America. I think there's a universal aspect in the idea of human and animal companionship. There's a universal aspect in the idea of poverty. But this is a movie about the United States, especially about the United States in the 2000s when she made it. And that's a quality that all of her movies share, this need to comment on and inhabit aspects of American life. And more often than not, we might say that Reichert stays on the low side of the social, economic, and cultural divide. She deals with characters who are not rich. Now, the question of whether her characters are not rich by circumstance, because it's a bad economy or they're unlucky, or not rich by choice, they choose to not want these things. When you were talking about Ken Kesey and Sometimes a Great Notion, that's a fantastic observation, because this is the sort of book that this character would read. And this is the sort of literature, that era of literature in the 50s and 60s, that encourages and supports the idea of drop out, don't connect to this, don't be part of this. This is bogus, this is corrupt, this is fake, choose your own path. So it's hard to tell in all of Reichert's films and in this film if the characters are poor because that's what they were born into, or if it's something that they choose, which makes them very different stories depending on what the answer to that question is. But no matter which way you choose to see that, and I'll try and do a little interpretation of Wendy and Lucy on that point, we might say that she makes movies about people who are outsiders, but they are outsiders in their own country of residence. Now that's an interesting idea. There are a lot of movies about immigrants, about immigrant stories. It's very normal to write a book or make a movie and someone feels uncomfortable or unfamiliar in a new place. If you come to America from Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, or if you come to America from the Middle East now in the 2000s, there's ways in which you might not necessarily feel at home. There are cultural divisions. But Reichert's characters are American. They belong in the United States, they're born in the United States, but they do not feel comfortable there. And it's not even that they want to leave the US. She doesn't make movies about people who want to get out. She makes movies about people who are trying to find a place within American life. And, very uncommonly for an American director, she makes movies about failure. Kelly Reichert's movies are not about people who succeed. Kelly Reichert's movies are about people who fail. Fail is not a great American theme. Failure is very important in American life. I think a lot of people feel like they're failing, and a lot of people are failing. But the American myth is to succeed, and to succeed on your own terms and not ask for help from other people. That's what is sort of in American mythology. But Kelly makes movies about people who fail or find only qualified success, or they partially succeed and they partially fail. So not only are they outsiders, not only are they people who feel like they don't belong, they're rarely found, they're rarely accepted, they're rarely happy at the end of her films. They are, to some extent, the other, even though they are already American. They're the other, they're the outsider within their own backyard. And one of the ways that her movies work is she constantly makes films about characters who feel alienated, who feel like outsiders. They meet other people like them, which means they have very strong positive connections, and then those connections don't always hold. There's moments of great community and great comfort in Kelly Reichert's films, but it doesn't usually last. So I just very quickly mentioned some of her other films because I hope for those of you who like this film, you find it interesting to watch the others, and then I'll talk about Wendy and Lucy. She made a film in 1994 called River of Grass, and if any of you have seen Bonnie and Clyde, or if any of you have seen Terrence Malick's film Badlands with Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen, River of Grass is worth seeing because it's a tribute to those movies, but it's a very particular tribute. It's not about glamorous outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, and it's not about murderers like Badlands. It's about a couple of losers, a man and a woman from Florida, who are on the run for a crime that they didn't even really commit with a gun that wasn't loaded, and they're not even really in trouble. The stakes in that movie are very, very low. They think that they're in more trouble than they really are. They just want to run away from their families and run away from their life in order to feel free. So they're lovers on the run, but no one is really chasing them. And the movie nods to Bonnie and Clyde and Badlands and to a certain kind of American cinema of the 1970s, a cinema that was very political, very engaged, very free, very exciting. It's trying to reclaim that feeling, but it's very modest, very low budget. It barely cost $100,000, and it has some of that same visual style that some of you found beautiful and some of you found banal. It's not dissimilar from Wendy and Lucy, it's just made a little bit more cheaply. And in River of Grass, we can see all the elements we see in other of Kelly's films. Characters who want to leave the city, characters who are lonely or melancholy, characters who feel very ambivalent towards the culture that they exist in, but they don't know what else they want to put in its place. When you mention Ken Kesey and Sometimes a Great Notion, often in revolutionary literature there is an idea of what you do instead. Kelly Reichert's characters don't know what they want to do instead. They just know that they don't want to do this. And that's why, to some extent, they feel like outsiders. That's why they feel so lonely. After River of Grass, Reichert waited a decade to make a film called Old Joy, which is my personal favorite of her films. And for what it's worth, I think it's one of the great American films of the 2000s. It's the one I really love. I like all of her other movies, including this one, but I love Old Joy. And it's a movie that made her prominent on the international film scene. Was shot on Oregon, based on a short story by the same writer, John Raymond. I liked your comparison of John Raymond to Raymond Carver. It's just a name thing, but it's actually not a bad comparison. He's an author who's become one of Reichert's collaborators. He's written all her movies since Old Joy. And it's the story of two friends named Mark and Kurt who have not seen each other since their late 20s. They're now maybe in their mid-30s, so they haven't seen each other for 10 or 15 years. Mark has become a husband and a father in the meantime, while Kurt, who's played by a musician named Will Oldham, has remained adrift. He works menial jobs, he goes to rock shows, he has nothing. and he's clinging to the same philosophy and attitudes that he had in his youth. So they go together on this road trip to this hot springs outside of Portland, which is supposed to be a place with healing properties. It's like a spa. And the idea is that they're going to mend their relationship when they go there, but they don't. These are two men who love each other, but they have grown apart. And as the film goes on, Reichert shows us very subtly that the film is from Mark's point of view, the more prosperous character, the more successful character, the more normally civilized character. Mark, this character, is a good guy. He's a left liberal, progressive values, believes in community equality. He listens to national public radio. He's a guy who the film's audience is going to like. But he feels alienated from Kurt, who's much more of a counterculture figure, and who hasn't compromised, who hasn't given up any of these things that Mark has kind of let go in order to have a family and in order to have a normal life. The film's title, Old Joy, is tremendously evocative, and it's central to understanding Kelly Reichert's films. Old joy, the line is, sorrow is just old joy, meaning you can't be sad if you weren't happy before. Sadness is only the memory of something that you were happy about that you no longer have. So he treasures his past, he knows he can't relive it, and that's where his sadness comes from. By the end of Old Joy, you get a sense that something has been lost. Not just Mark and Kurt's friendship, but some larger sense of solidarity among characters like this. These are people who 10 or 15 years ago felt united in the fact that they didn't belong in America and they wanted something else. And now even they've drifted apart. Even they can't agree on what it is that they want. Old Joy is made in a very patient way. It's a very meditative, quiet, minimal film. People compare its visual style to movies that were being made in Iran, to movies that were being made in Taiwan, movies that were made in Thailand. Reichert was being compared to international filmmakers more than to American ones. But it is an American movie to its absolute core. It was released at the beginning of the second Bush presidency, and it's a movie about a kind of American like Mark or Kurt, and also I would say like Kelly Reichert or like John Raymond, who wondering where they fit in the country. They felt like they could not relate, and I've interviewed Kelly Reichert about this. She could not relate to George Bush as president. She couldn't relate to the people who voted for somebody like George Bush. She couldn't relate to that culture. So she made a movie about feeling lonely and lost within that, in a country divided by war and ideology. And that's why people see her works, including Wendy and Lucy, as political. Wendy and Lucy begins a series of films in which Reichert, even though she's an independent filmmaker, has begun working with movie stars. I'm surprised none of you mentioned the performance, or if not the performance, just the presence of Michelle Williams, who is a teen television star from Dawson's Creek, and a pretty glamorous Oscar-nominated movie star as well. Just last year or 2 years ago, she played Marilyn Monroe in a biopic. So that's one of the things that happened to Kelly Reichert. As she became more successful, she's able to work with these kinds of actresses. Williams has been in another one of her films called Meek's Cutoff, which is a Western set in the 1890s. It's a film that the first shot is of a rock with the word lost carved into it, which is a kind of very good summary of Kelly Reichert's themes. I would say Meek's Cutoff is about the beginning of the America that we see in Reichert's films. It's set in the 1890s. It's about a group of settlers who are on their way to California, and they're lost. Their guide is sort of not taking them in the right direction, and they're trying to figure out the right way to get there. She also made a movie last year called Night Moves with Jesse Eisenberg from The Social Network and Dakota Fanning. It's a really interesting film. It's a very scary film. It's about 3 environmental radicals who plan to blow up a hydroelectric dam, and then after the dam blows up, they get very paranoid that they're going to get caught. Meek's Cutoff is about an older time. It's about the promise of America and the difficulties of actually getting to that place in one piece. Night Moves, like Wendy and Lucy and Old Joy, shows that the promised land of America isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Not everyone is happy to be part of this. Many people feel lost within America. In some of these films, Reichert is experimenting with genre. Meek's Cutoff is a Western, Night Moves is a thriller, but in all cases she has a quiet, poetic film style, and she melds the conventions of the genre to fit her style. Meek's Cutoff is a very sort of severe, dusty, old-fashioned movie. Night Moves is tense and dark, but they're all quiet, they're all minimal, they're all poetic. They all, to some extent, look and sound like Wendy and Lucy. But the important thing about all these films is that at their core, as I said, they're about people who feel like outsiders. They're about people, in the case of Meek's Cutoff, they literally don't have a country to call their own yet because they haven't made it to California. And Night Moves, they don't want to be part of America. In fact, they want to blow the part of America that they don't agree with up and sort of celebrate within the ruins. Which brings us to finally now, Wendy and Lucy, which I want to talk about a little bit before we do a Q&A. Since we just watched it, I don't need to recap the plot, but when I saw this film for the first time in 2008, I was struck by the fact, as some of you seem to be, that Reichert does not provide any explanation about why Wendy is on the way to Alaska. It's never really explained in a totally convincing, satisfactory way why she's doing what she's doing. Part of this is that Kelly Reichert is by nature a kind of dramatic minimalist. She likes to withhold all but the most necessary narrative information. Some people think that makes her a very interesting storyteller. Some people are bored stiff by it and they want more narrative information. The question is not whether we like it or not. The question is it's a determined strategy as opposed to something she forgot. So that's the main thing, that's the main way I want to talk about the film. It's not an accident that we don't know. It's not a lapse of her artistic judgment that we don't know. She doesn't want to tell us because she wants to create a certain amount of space so we can judge what we're watching in the film and kind of activate ourselves as a viewer instead of being told everything. I think she wants us to speculate why this young, healthy, attractive, articulate, seemingly educated, and seemingly very capable woman is willing, or is desperate maybe, to live hand to mouth out of her car for such a long period of time. We want to know what could have happened to put her in this situation, or did she choose this situation for herself, and why? Is she an idealist who's read too many Ken Kesey novels maybe, who's now trying to live on her own terms? Is she romantic about that idea of going out on the road and living off the grid and being away from a society that she doesn't believe in? Is she a victim of economic circumstance? Is she coming out of a bad relationship? Is she coming out of a broken family? Is it some combination of all of these things? To me, all of these possibilities are plausible because this is a movie that takes place in the real world. These are all reasons that she could be doing this. And I think that it gives us a lot of space to speculate without being sensationalistic, without being prurient, without giving us a bunch of stuff that's really over the top to imagine. It's all pretty believable. And she also leaves space for some other questions as well. For me, the big question when I watch this film is, does her friendship with Lucy, her dog, indicate the depth of her compassion and humanity? Does it show what a good, compassionate, humane person she is? Or does it beg the question, why is she clinging solely for companionship to this dog? Why does she have so much trouble interacting with other human beings? Do we see this dog as evidence of her being like a really capable, responsible person with sort of deep feelings and a deep capacity for responsibility? Or is this a crutch? Is this something that she's clinging to? Why is she obsessed with her dog and so indifferent to the people who she meets? I find these to be interesting questions. The awkwardness that Wendy has with other people is evident in the first scene in the movie, which we may have forgotten by the end because it doesn't have anything to do with the dog being lost or the dog being found, but it's an important scene, and it's the scene that I want to use to address this idea of encountering the other. It's the first of several scenes in Wendy and Lucy in which Wendy encounters some version of the other, though I will show in every case the people she meets aren't really the other, they're not really strangers. She keeps meeting versions of herself as this movie goes on, and to me that's the strategy that Kelly Reichert is using. The group at the campfire in the first scene certainly look stranger than she does. These are guys with piercings, tattoos, beards, they're drinking, the firelight makes them look strange, they're an odd group of people. They seem to be outsiders as well. Even the fact that they're just meeting in the woods in the middle of the night to kind of have this party instead of hanging out inside the town means that they are outsiders. And she's afraid when she comes across their party. She is not eager to join them. Who joins them? The dog joins them. The dog is friendlier than she is. And I think you made a really wonderful point, or it was one of you two, that often people are nicer to people on the street if they see a dog, and then you won't make eye contact with strangers or talk to them if people are on their own. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that scene indicates that. Wendy is afraid of these people, but she's intrigued by them as well. Why is she intrigued by them? Well, because they seem to provide a model for what she's doing. They tell her, go to Alaska. There's jobs there. There's work. They're validating this choice that she seems to have made. And what you were saying, one of you, about migrant workers is a great point. That is absolutely one of the things that Wendy and Lucy is about, this contingent employment and this idea that you have to move around the country just to find any kind of employment, even though that also obviously has its drawbacks. Wendy isn't comfortable in this group, but really she's less of an outsider within it than she believes. She's young like these people are. She obviously seems to believe some of the same things that they do. She's ultimately headed for the same place that they have all worked already. This is her cohort of people, and she finds them right at the beginning of the movie, and yet she chooses to leave them. She chooses to not stay with them. She chooses to kind of go off on her own. What Reichert is doing here is showing us Wendy's vulnerability as a woman who is traveling alone through America, as well as her bravery and strength in undertaking the journey. In a different movie, she might settle in with this group. She might try and fit in, but she is determined to make it on her own, whether that's a good idea or not. She leaves not because she's been rejected. They don't kick her out. They don't say, we don't like you. They don't say, don't come around here anymore. But because she can't sense any companionship beyond what she has with Lucy. And she identifies with this dog and needs this dog more than any of these young men or women who she meets by the fire. It's an odd way to start a movie, because this is a character who we see how lonely she is for the rest of the movie, and yet she won't stay with these people who seem to like her and welcome her in the first scene. Now, Wendy and Lucy has been described by some critics as a road movie without the road. Right? It's hard to go on the road, to use the title of the book by Jack Kerouac, a contemporary of Ken Kesey, if your car breaks down. Usually if you make a road movie, you have a car that works. This is a road movie where the car breaks down, and so you can't hit the road, you have to stay in one place. This is another way to become the other in America. This is another way to be the outsider in America. America is a country ruled by automobiles, and to not have a car makes you a prisoner of your immediate environment. You cannot get around the United States without a car. It's a car-crazy culture. It's very symbolically important that her car breaks down. That is how you become a marginalized figure within the US, if you cannot drive. In fact, in short order, the film takes away from Lucy the only two things materially that she really seems to have. It takes away her car, and it takes away her dog. And having to pay for the car and being trapped, needing the car to be fixed, has an impact on the urgency she has to look for the dog. It doesn't seem like a lot happens narratively in this movie, but the relationships between these things are very close. If her car hadn't broken down, it'd be easier for her to look for her dog. It might be easier for her to sort of do what she's doing. Instead, she has to kind of walk around the town. And because she has to pay for the car, she can't, get a hotel and wait around for the dog to come back. The urgency of losing the car and dog at the same time is what drives this film's plot forward. There is a definite aspect of economic commentary, as many of you smartly pointed out in Wendy and Lucy. The idea that it's impossible in America to live off your savings. I did think it was funny that many of you said she seems to have a lot of money. She doesn't have a lot of money. She has $500. She doesn't have like she has like maybe half a week's pay in a typical job. And you guys are saying that she has all this money that she's wasting on stuff. She has nothing. You see her book that she's writing, and she's living hand to mouth, down to the cent. Again, that may be her choice, but she does not have a lot of money. And that little amount of money that she has really does not last for a long time. There's a commentary here that it is hard to just save money. You have to make money. You have to get a job. You have to some extent, buy into the rules of society. In order to get a job, you need an address. You need to be able to put down roots. You have to stay in one place. It is hard to be a migrant worker. It is hard to be a transitory worker. We see this in the film. In practical terms, we know Wendy's not going to settle down in this town. She's just passing through. But by being rootless, by being on the road, her vulnerability is increased. She's much more vulnerable than if she lived there. She's much more vulnerable because she is not a resident of this place. She is an outsider. In fact, by being an outsider in this town, we might say, to use a literary reference, that she's entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers, which is one of the major themes also of Wendy and Lucy. Now, that kindness is actually mostly forthcoming, to be honest. Aside from the convenience store clerk who turns her in for stealing dog food, who I find to be the only kind of unrealistic character in the film, I don't like the performance of that young actor playing that guy. The townspeople are all pretty nice to Wendy. I don't think the mechanic is trying to swindle her. I think he's trying to give her a pretty good deal on the car. The store security guard lets her use his phone and then is even nicer to her as the movie goes along, and so on. Reichert's films are in some ways very critical of American values and identity. People have actually called her an anti-American filmmaker, but I think that that's nonsense. I think that they're very affectionate to the things that Americans like about themselves and that they say about themselves, which is that idea of kindness, that idea of friendliness, that idea of hospitality. It shines through in the middle of Wendy's tribulations, even if she doesn't always recognize it. To me, what makes Wendy and Lucy realistic and what makes it moving is all these characters, even the ones who seem to have a lot of power over her, or even the ones who seem to be blocking her in some way, are all struggling as much as Lucy is. She is not driven into a town where everyone is doing great. She is not driven into a town where everyone is settled in their ways and she feels like she's fallen way behind them. This is a town where people are not doing well at all. The older security guard, the white-haired gentleman, and that's a very symbolic character. He's a security guard and he becomes Wendy's protector in the film. He could have made the guy, a dishwasher repairman. She could have made him a dishwasher repairman, but she doesn't. She makes him a security guard. He's a protector figure. He seems to be living hand to mouth. When he gives Wendy money at the end, it's like a couple of dollars. He treats it like it's a really big thing that he's doing because you know what? For him, it is. The generosity is enormous and the sum of money is tiny. And that's a deeply moving tension that Reichert is aware of in how she's making the film. The spirit is generous, but this is not someone who's going to be anybody's benefactor. Wendy feels like an outsider from the beginning of the movie to the end, but she's really surrounded by people like herself in every way. She's surrounded by people who have contingent employment, who don't have a lot, people who also are not doing very well. And there are moments where she seems to acknowledge this, to acknowledge that she and these people are not so different, but her focus is obsessively on finding her dog instead of forging friendships. I've watched this movie 2 or 3 times. She's not terribly nice to the other people within the film. And for some of us, that might make her a very unlikable heroine. And for others, we might wonder, well, why is she like this? Because as many of you have pointed out, the film doesn't give a lot of backstory. The most powerful and last scene I'm going to discuss about encountering the other in Wendy and Lucy, though, and another scene that I think is key to the film, and it's one that none of you brought up, so I'm glad that I get to sort of talk about it fresh. It's when she spends the night in the woods and she's accosted by a homeless man, played, just as a piece of trivia, by a very good American horror film director named Larry Fessenden, who's actually one of Kelly Reichert's best friends, who also produced the film. Fessenden is playing a kind of archetype here. This is the babbling hobo. This is the scary homeless guy. This is in some ways a kind of an offensive character maybe that he's playing. And Wendy is very frightened of his appearance. It's after his appearance that she has that little breakdown in the bathroom. But I think there's more to it than that. To me, what Larry's character is representing is a cracked mirror version of Wendy herself. This is also a guy who lives off the grid and on his own terms, and we see that he has ended up half crazy and isolated, babbling about nothing in particular. He's older than she is, but he is not terribly different than she is. Physically different, behaviorally different, but fundamentally, to me, what that scene is about is her encountering a possible version of herself. Wendy's fear at losing Lucy, at being stranded, at being alone, those things are all magnified at the appearance of this character. That's why it's the scene in the movie where she breaks down, where her composure cracks, where she cries, where she really, truly seems to be desperate. It hasn't happened before. It happens after that. Fessenden's Drifter is an other for sure. He's a scary character, but I also see him in some ways as Wendy's twin, and that's where her terror comes from. She's not afraid of him because he's different, because he's the other. She's afraid of him because maybe on some level this is a version of herself. Wendy and Lucy is a movie that, and people find this frustrating, it doesn't judge the protagonist's choices. It doesn't judge her attempt to steal dog food. People may watch this movie and be convinced that the movie thinks it was a dumb thing for her to do, and people may watch this movie and be convinced that it makes perfect sense that she would do that. That's the sign of a movie that doesn't judge. It doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you that it's right or wrong that she did it. But even though it doesn't judge those choices, this is a movie that is also unique in that it shows she's responsible for those choices. It may not judge what she does, but it doesn't say anyone else made that decision for her. She made that decision, good or bad, right or wrong, for herself. And that's why I think Wendy's encounter with this homeless man is less about the sense that she's physically threatened or that he might hurt her, than it's an epiphany that she has that this is one possible route, one possible road that her choices are going to lead her towards. Not that she's going to literally become this guy, but that some version of what this guy's life is could be hers the way that she's going, and maybe even that's what she wants, and that makes her even more alarmed. There is one final consideration of the other in Wendy and Lucy, and that's the character of Lucy herself. One of you pointed out, I think extremely smartly, that Lucy is a kind of structuring absence in the movie. She is gone for most of the movie. The title is Wendy and Lucy as if they're the two main characters, but Lucy's in it for what, 10 minutes at the beginning? Maybe 5 minutes at the end? The question of her whereabouts hangs over everything that Wendy does. On one hand, this makes Wendy and Lucy a very simple movie. Kelly Reichert, like some of you, is a dog owner. Lucy is in fact her dog, and if you see Old Joy, she appears in Old Joy as a dog named Lucy, so she's playing herself in 2 films. It showcases the beauty and strength of the bond between humans and animals. I mean, it does, and I'm not being sarcastic when I say that, but I also think it does more than that. It is perfectly fine to see this as a movie that is about the bond between people and their dogs. I'm a cat owner. Cats are lame compared to dogs, but you know, whenever there's a movie where an animal gets lost or endangered, I feel it as well, so I think that's totally valid. But I think she's doing something else. Lucy is not a pet, she is a companion. We worry about her right along with Michelle Williams' character. That's drama 101, get a dog in trouble. But there's also a symbolic dimension here as well. Lucy is a female dog, she's a girl. She's a female dog with a girl's name, Lucy, like Wendy. And like Wendy, she's also a wanderer. You can imagine a parallel version of this movie about Lucy's encounters. Where was Lucy this whole time? Who did she run into? Where did she sleep at night? How did she eat? Who did she find? Who did she meet? Who looked after her? They're on parallel tracks, even though we only see one of them. To me, their experiences during the duration of the movie are probably very similar. We just happen to stick with the human character. You can imagine her own dark, lonely night while wondering where her owner is, as Lucy is having her own dark, lonely night wondering where her dog is. When Wendy finally finds Lucy, she's been found and taken in by what seem to be nice people. In fact, when I was listening in the hallway, I think that's the exact way she describes them, right? She says something like, that man looks nice. I haven't seen the movie in a year or two, so I can't remember the exact line, but I think that's what she says. These are the same sort of nice people who've tried to help Wendy, in fact. The people who adopt the dog are also residents of this town. They're not different than the people who Wendy has been encountering for this film. The difference is that Wendy can't, or won't, or refuses, or will not allow herself to be looked after in this way. Now, obviously, she's not a dog. She can't just knock on someone's door and say, I'm going to live in your backyard and you can feed me. But she won't let herself be taken in and helped in the same way that she seems to recognize is best for her pet. And she also recognizes that this makes her a bit of a problematic owner for Lucy, which, given how little she has, I mean, we don't seem to think she's a parent yet, and we don't seem, I mean, she could be, but she doesn't seem to be a parent, she doesn't seem to have kids, she doesn't have a job, she doesn't have any connections. This dog is all she has, and realizing that the choices that she's made make her a bad owner for this dog is devastating, even if it's acted by Williams in a very subtle way. So here's what she does, and here's how I conclude what I think of Wendy and Lucy. She takes the thing that she cannot, for whatever reason, take for herself, a safe, fixed home, the certainty of a place to live and be loved and be looked after. She takes that thing and she transfers it to her dog. And she takes herself out of the equation entirely. She gives her dog that thing that she doesn't seem to be interested in keeping, or if she's not interested, she's not capable of having for herself, and leaves Lucy with these new owners. And while I find this to be moving, I also find it to be very ambiguous. I find it to be a very mysterious outcome for this movie. As a film critic and just as a film lover, I like that ambiguity. I like that mystery rather than being told exactly what it means. Is this an act of kindness, or is this a kind of awful refusal of responsibility? If we believe that there's a real bond between Wendy and Lucy, the same way that there might be between two people who are friends or two people who are family members, can you really just fawn your responsibilities off on other people? Is that really a noble thing to do? Is that really the right thing to do? Is she abandoning her friend? Is she punishing herself? Is she giving Lucy the sort of life that she secretly desires but for whatever reason can't ease into? She knows she's not going to have this kind of life in human terms, but she wants her dog to have it. In the last moment between them, and there's that slow motion shot that Reichert uses of Lucy kind of looking up, which is an amazingly beautiful and mysterious shot to me. In these moments, we might say that Wendy is encountering the other, because people and animals are not really supposed to be able to understand each other, and we are not considered to be the same thing. And we know that Lucy cannot comprehend the subtle emotion of what's happening, and is never going to understand rationally in a human way what Wendy is doing for her. But it also seems to me that they are not other from each other. It seems to me that they are one and the same. And what Wendy is saying goodbye to here, somewhat painfully and I think with some difficulty, is a part of herself. And at the end of a film where I believe she's encountered so many people who reflect so many different aspects of her character, she is now totally and finally alone within the film. When she's on the train at the end of the movie, she came into the movie with Lucy. Even when Lucy was lost, the possibility of having Lucy is kind of what drove her forward. And she's never really alone, because even when she tries to be alone, she gets intruded upon, or she runs across other people, or she goes to other people. At the end of the film, she is totally, finally, completely alone, and it seems like that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. Whether this is exactly how she wants it, because this is something that she's buying into and believes is important, or this is a corner that she's been backed into and can't find a way out of, is hard to say. That is the ambiguous space that I think Wendy and Lucy operates in. It's a space that some of you might find really exciting to be in and some of you might find frustrating to be in, but I kind of just wanted in this lecture to move around within that space and create stuff that we can talk about in our discussion. So I'm through, but I'd be very interested to talk to all of you.
Okay. All right, so we